Hi everyone, welcome to Study the Quran with a Traveler. Today we're going to be taking a look at a brief commentary on the conditions for marriage in the Quran. So before we take a look at the conditions for marriage in the Quran, we're going to see how marriage is described in the Quran itself. So if you take a look at the Quran, marriage is referred to as a solemn covenant or agreement between two parties. And the proof for this is that it uses the Arabic word mithaq ghalidh, and not the word aqd, which is basically used for contracts. Now, even though they're not exactly the same thing, they share many aspects, such as who can enter into it, terms and conditions of the agreement, any roles and responsibilities involved, and how to terminate the agreement. So, now that we have a general idea of what marriage is according to the Quran, we can start taking a look at the conditions for marriage found in the Quran. So, there's a pretty interesting article online. I think it was written by Ro Wasim. He's a Muslim and he seems to be studying the Quran quite a lot. He wrote about a lot of these points, which we will be looking at. And we're going to start with mental maturity, obviously. Now, mental maturity, it is clearly highlighted in the Quran in chapter 4, verse 6, which says, "And test the fatherless when they have reached marriage. If you find them to be of sound judgment, deliver to them their property." So here it is clear that if someone reaches marriageable age, they must be mentally mature enough to handle financial matters. Now, you could obviously look at it a different way, just because they've reached marriageable age doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be of sound judgment. But then again, um, any piece of information can be interpreted in any way. But what matters is looking at what the wider context says and what the author intends for the reader to understand. But this is generally used as a verse to justify that whoever is getting married is generally expected to have sound judgment. Now we're going to go to the next condition, which is physical maturity. Now, when it comes to physical maturity, there is a very debatable verse in the Quran found in chapter 65, verse 4, which says, "And for such of your women as despair of menstruation, if you doubt, their waiting period is 3 months, as well as for those who have not menstruated. And for those who are bearing, their waiting period is until they lay down their burden." Now, first of all, we need to understand what sort of women are being talked about when the waiting period is being discussed in the Quran. First of all, women who no longer menstruate. Second, which is the point we're going to be looking at in more depth, are women who have not menstruated, and not women who are yet to menstruate. And then obviously pregnant women, that's been discussed at the end. Now, what we need to take a look at is traditionalists basically use the second point to prove their argument that young girls who have not yet menstruated can be married, although they do differ about when such a marriage can be consummated. And the reason they use this interpretation of the verse is not only to justify early child marriages that take place in today's world, but to kind of back up the hadith that says that the Prophet also married Aisha when she was just 6 and then later on consummated the marriage. Now, it's important to notice that the verse above uses the Arabic phrase lamhez, which basically means not menstruated, and it doesn't mean not yet menstruated. So this is the verse that you can take a look at. And the reason to understand this difference is because it is common for women to not be able to menstruate because of medical reasons or physical reasons. However, this does not prevent them from marrying and, if needed, divorcing. And then again, Sam Garen's another person that I follow who also studies the Quran extensively, pointed out the Arabic grammar in the above verse basically refers to the previous group of people that was being discussed, which is also women. The relative pronoun and the verb are in the feminine plural and refer to women. This basically denotes that this is talking about women and not a different category of females, such as girls. So, what the main takeaways are basically the literal translation of the above verse, the usage of the pronoun, as well as other conditions set by the Quran for marriage. Keeping all of those in mind, it would be a stretch to say that young girls can get married and then divorced. But this is something you could do more research on, obviously, and better yet, understand the Arabic behind it. But as already pointed out, traditionalists use this verse to refer to young girls who have not yet menstruated, even though the Arabic clearly talks about women who have not menstruated. And it's very possible for a woman to reach physical maturity and not be able to menstruate, like I said, for medical reasons. So we're going to take a look at another very interesting perspective, our condition to get married that has kind of been implied in the Quran, and that is the ability to hold a value system. Now let's take a look at what a value system is. So it's basically a set of principles and beliefs that guide an individual's decisions and actions. It kind of shapes their understanding of what's important or desirable and what's good or bad. And this concept is talked about in the Quran in verse 2 of chapter 2, verse 221, which says, "And marry not idolatresses until they believe. And a believing slave girl is better than an idolatress, though she impress you. And similarly, and give not in marriage to idolaters until they believe. And a believing slave is better than an idolater, though he impress you." So what we can take away from this is that a believer is someone who holds a certain set of beliefs, right? And the Quran instructs that one should get married to a believer. And it's basically an adult who can not only, possess knowledge about the religion of God, but understand that knowledge and then also determine whether the potential partner holds similar views. So this is kind of straightforward, Children are taught value systems or belief systems, and adults are expected to hold them and then take decisions accordingly. So from the above verse, you can kind of deduce that the Quran wants believers to marry believers, and hence adults with the correct belief systems marrying other adults who hold correct belief systems. Now, obviously, we need to consider the other side of the agreement. And traditionalists, what they do is they argue that parents and guardians can take a decision on behalf of the girl, which has been implied in the verse above, where it says, "And give not in marriage to idolaters," right? But then again, in the Quran, when you're talking about a woman getting married, it is very important to get her consent. And consent is something that only a person who has a strong understanding of the situation, its consequences, its implications can provide, not a child who is not aware of those. So, then again, everything that we're taking a look at, that we will be taking a look at, will align with the fact that a woman is someone who is an adult female who can provide consent, who can, handle their own matters such as inheritance, ask for property, request marriage, or is accountable for actions, is the one that can actually get married. So that's the third condition. The fourth condition is basically marriage is like a contract. So recently we saw that marriage is not exactly a contract, but it is very much similar to a contract. And if you take a look at the phrase which is used in Surah An-Nisa, which is chapter 4, verse 21, which says, "And they, your wives, have taken from you a solemn covenant." Now, this isn't just some simple agreement between two parties. It's a very strong term. It's a very strong understanding or agreement between two parties. And this is proven by the fact that this term is used elsewhere in the Quran to describe prophetic covenants and covenants that were made between God and the children of Israel. And I'm not sure why exactly the Quran uses a different word for contracts and solemn agreements, but one of the reasons that it does could be that a covenant or a solemn agreement is basically between two parties that are not just interested in a transaction, but they already hold personal bonds or familial bonds. And hence, not only are you carrying out the contract, the agreement in the best way possible, but you're carrying it out in a way that it does not adversely affect those personal relationships that existed before that certain agreement. Whereas a contract is more like an exchange or an agreement between two parties that may or may not be related to each other. So that's my understanding. And like I always do, I encourage you to do your own research. Now, why is this condition important? Because even though marriage has not exactly been called a contract according to the Quran, it is like a contract. And hence, when we treat it as a contract, we need to see what are the conditions to fulfill a contract. And the first condition is to basically be able to fulfill that contract and honesty. Now, who can fulfill a contract? Not a child, obviously. It's only somebody who has the resources, the understanding, and the strength to fulfill that contract, whether it be physical or mental strength. So that's the first thing. And then again, the second thing that is required to fulfill a contract is mutual consent, as highlighted in chapter 4, verse 29, unless it is a trade conducted with mutual consent among you. And then again, children aren't really in a state to give consent because only an adult who is aware of the situation, the implications of something, can provide true consent. So that is another condition or another proof that only adults can get married. And then again, obviously or naturally, we come to the fifth condition, which is consent itself. This is pretty straightforward. If you take a look at chapter 4 of the Quran, verse 19, it says, O you who have chosen to be graced with belief, it is not lawful for you to force women into marrying or holding on to them in marriage against their will. Then again, it is talking about women, which are adult females, and it is talking about not forcing them into marriage or holding on to them in marriage. Now, we're going to take a look at point 6, or condition number 6, which is very interesting. And then again, the credit goes to Ro Wasim, whose article I did read. It is the ability to maintain a lifestyle. So when the Quran talks about people that are getting divorced, it talks about them in a very certain way. So we're going to take a look at this verse, which is in chapter 65, and it is verse 6, which says, Let them, the divorced women, live where you live, with the same standard of living that you have and according to your best means. Harass them not to make life difficult for them, and if they are pregnant, spend on them freely until they deliver their burden. Then, if they nurse your baby, give them their due recompense. And frequently consult together amicably. And if both of you find it difficult, let another woman suckle the baby on her behalf. So, when we take a look at this verse, there are some important takeaways that we can conclude. A child cannot provide a place to live or maintain someone's living standard. A child cannot spend on someone freely. Obviously, when you were kids, you remember those times when you would go out and, you would kind of count the pennies you had or the dollars you had or, whatever currency you had. And you would always be kind of like, okay, this is what I can buy, what I can't buy. That's kind of like what it feels like to be a kid or a teenager, right? Even though, to be honest, it's kind of the same thing when you're an adult. But then again, there are times when you can spend freely. And then, most importantly, the Quran implies that whoever is getting married and if they're getting divorced, they're somebody that is mature enough to discuss matters regardless of negative feelings or potential negative feelings towards each other. So I think this is a very beautiful verse that kind of talks about the essence of getting married, getting divorced if required. And it is only those individuals who are going to be adults, because only adults can kind of maintain a same standard of living. And by standard of living, it's not something you just maintain for a few days or a few weeks or a few months. It's something you can maintain throughout the years. And, when you talk about, let alone kids, you're talking about teenagers or people who are not very mature. Um, they they really can't be mature if they have extremely negative feelings towards each other. But an adult is basically someone who's considered to have the ability to discuss different sorts of matters, even if they have some sort of quarrel with the other person. So I think this is another condition, this and the ability to have mature conversations when you're getting married and, if required, getting divorced. And lastly, we're coming towards the end of this video. Can you call yourself a lady? So, to conclude, the Quran clearly distinguishes between children and adults. For somebody who might say, oh, the Quran basically talks about believers, female and male believers, right? It really doesn't talk about old people or, children generally. But there are verses in the Quran that clearly talk about children. So if the Quran was to advocate for child marriage, it would have used that term that it uses when talking about children. And proof of that is here in chapter 24, verse 58, which says it's talking about people, when they go to somebody's house, they should ask permission. And over here, it is talking about, those who have not yet reached puberty. So it's been very clear that the Quran does talk about children. And if it's not talking about children, or using the Arabic term for children when discussing who can get married, it's pretty obvious who can and who can't get married. Now, the conclusion we can take away from this, for some reason, sorry, my box isn't going down for some reason, that's odd, but for some reason, okay, I can kind of zoom in. So the Quran refers to men and women when it's talking about different aspects of marriage. And then obviously mental and physical maturity is required for marriage. We discussed that. The ability to maintain a standard of living and discuss difficult matters. Even after divorce is necessary, consent is required. Women cannot be forced into marriage, let alone girls. And then again, one of the most controversial verses, which is in chapter 65, verse 4, is that the Quran talks about women and not girls who are yet to menstruate. So this is basically an overview of the conditions to get married. And like I stated before, there can be different interpretations of verses. And what matters is trying to understand what the essence of the book is, what the author intends, and, kind of looking at things in a logical manner. So I hope this was helpful for you. It gives you an idea of how marriage is described in the Quran and who is eligible to get married. And it kind of serves as the starting point to researching this topic more in depth. But thank you for tuning in and have a nice evening wherever you are.